Good morning. It has been a while since I've seen you all like this, or more correctly, you all have seen me like this. This was not the way that I anticipated today's message going, but here we are. It's one of those fun, crazy times. I really and truly was hoping that things were going to calm down a little bit for a couple of weeks. I mean, between me getting a cold virus respiratory thing earlier this week, thinking that's all that this was, and in fact that's all that was for a while, and because I tested it, I knew that. And then Emily being in a boot for a bit, and then yesterday morning waking up and not being able to smell Jack's diaper. Most of the time you would think that would be a good thing, right? Not so much this go around. So this is where we are right now. And I know it's the time of year that we're in. I was hoping for a couple of weeks because, Thanksgiving is coming. And despite what Walmart and Dollar General and literally I think every retailer out there is saying right now, there is in fact a holiday in between Halloween and Christmas. Even if you're only selling those decorations for like 2 days prior to it, and then everything really, really switches over to all red and silver and gold and green and Christmassy types of stuff. It's all starting to come at us, isn't it? Now, it is also the end of the Christian year. The first day of the new Christian year is always the first Sunday of Advent. And for us this year, that comes up at the end of this month. The last Sunday of the Christian calendar then is always Christ the King Sunday. Now, what I didn't know was that this is a relatively new thing as far as the Christian calendar is concerned. And in fact, Christ the King Sunday is only about 100 years old, and celebrating it on the last Sunday before Advent is even younger than that. It's barely older than I am at this point. So here's the short history lesson for how we get there. This will save you the Google search later, or we'll give you some things to look up if you want to go dive deeper into this. It is kind of interesting, but only if you're really a nerd do I suggest going in and getting into the weeds of this. But you can trace the concept of Christ the King theologically back to the early church fathers. We have had an understanding as Jesus as King for a very, very long time, and had a theology for that worked out for a very long time. But the actual Sunday can be traced back to what we call the Roman question. Now, if you aren't sure what that is, this is you have to go back to the Pope and the Papal States back in the early to mid 1800s. This was in the middle of the time in Europe when things were in transition, when we were beginning to see industrial revolutions that were taking place, and we're moving away from medieval fiefdoms and kingdoms, that sort of things, into more of the things we were going to see in the future. But this was a very long period of transition in there, and so starting back in the 1840s, the Papal States came into conflict with others. And Napoleon III helped to restore the Pope to control of that territory, but then that was going to get challenged during the Franco-Prussian War, excuse me, and the beginning of the Kingdom of Italy, such that by the time we get to 1920, the temporal or formal secular power of the Pope really only went so far as the Vatican Quarter of Rome. And in 1929, the Lateran Treaty was signed that essentially made Vatican City its own little tiny country in the middle of Rome, and the Pope gave up claim to any of the former papal states. So I know that's a good, if short, history lesson there, but what does that mean for us? That's what we're going to spend a couple weeks getting at. Because what happened then does impact us today insofar as it's a way that we view the world, especially the world that we view the way that we view the world we live in now. You hear these words and see what sounds familiar there. Nations and kingdoms will fight against each other. There will be great earthquakes and wide-scale food shortages and epidemics. There will also be terrifying sights and great signs in the skies. But before all this occurs, they will take you into custody and harass you because of your faith. Does any of that sound uncomfortably familiar? I mean, it probably does. It was a pretty good description of the period when Christ the King Sunday was instituted back in the 1920s. It's the same feeling that many have had over the centuries. And just as often as we begin to feel these things come up, there are always going to be people around us who then want to use those things, those feelings, for their own purposes. But that is not Jesus' intent. His is something so much more than that. It's easy to hear those words and to get stirred up, or to get worried, or to get really anxious, because if we aren't careful, those words can become a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. That the more we get tied up with them, the more anxious we get about them, the more that can actually lead those things to happen, which is exactly the opposite of what Jesus is looking for there. So let's take a step back from all that and look at what it was that Jesus was actually saying in these verses. Go back to verse 5, where we started our scripture reading for today. Some people were talking about the temple, how it was decorated with beautiful stones and ornaments dedicated to God. In context of where we are and when we are, it's okay to hear something in these words. It's okay to hear even tones of pride in the voices of the folks who are saying these things. That these, as if these stones and these ornaments are going to last forever. Have you ever done that? Have you ever walked into a majestic space and had that thought? It could even be kind of a natural space, like going up onto the mountains or standing out on a beach looking out at the oceans, or it could even be looking across Kansas. I know I make fun of Kansas a lot because it's easy to see Colorado from the state border, the Missouri state border. But all of that space even has its own kind of beauty. And it's easy to think that those things will last forever. But Jesus says to the folks who are saying this, he says, "As for the things you are admiring, the time is coming when not even one stone will be left upon another. All will be demolished." Now, for lack of maybe a better term for this sounds an awful lot like Jesus is kind of condemning things to failure. It's why this passage in Luke is sometimes referred to as the little apocalypse. I know it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around that an apocalypse could be little, but it's a genre of literature apocalypse, not the apocalypse. But that's what it's referred to as. But when we do that, though, we have to be careful that we can often get the order of the world mixed up, the way that things are supposed to work. Because in the next verse, the disciples who were hearing Jesus teach here asked him to clarify what it was that he was saying. And he says to them, in effect, "Come gather around, children. Let me tell you what to expect and what to do." He says, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to claim that they are coming in my name, and they're going to say a whole lot of things. And you're going to hear about a lot of other things that are going on too. And they're all going to sound awful, and they're all going to sound horrible. And that's not the end either. Jesus is very clear on this point. That's not the end either. And then he says, and this is where maybe this gets most of us. He says, "But before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name." And he tells them that they will be betrayed even by people that they know, some that they're even close to. And how does Jesus handle this? He says, "Listen to my words. Hold on to them. Hold on to your faith, because that will be what sees you through and what ultimately will give you life." Why does that work? Go towards the end of this chapter. This is long past our scripture reading for this morning. This is verse 33. "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Remember where we were last week. One season passes into the next, into the next, into the next, and so on and so forth. And our choice in the middle of these changing seasons is to either do better or to do worse than we have done before. And our choice always should be to do better. Why? Because if we don't end up better, we end up like Samson. Remember, we told the story of Samson last week, where Samson was the end result of many, many bad choices. And as the seasons turned from one to the next, the Israelites chose just to do a little bit worse each and every time, till we get to Samson, who never should have been a hero, much less a judge over Israel, yet he was the best they had. Rather, that we want to imitate as Christ followers folks like the apostles, like the early church leaders, like all of those saints that have gone before us, that somehow in the middle of things that, in the middle of everything else in life, and some of them suffering unimaginable things, they still not only kept their faith, but still somehow in the midst of that found life. And not in spite of what happened to them, not because of what happened to them, but just as they were living their life, they were still able to find it in the midst of those things. Man, how did they do that? Next Sunday is Christ the King Sunday, but we're starting that journey today because we need to make sure that we're clear on some things. As Jesus is speaking in Luke 21, he's saying to his disciples, "Come and gather around." And he's saying the same thing to us because these times always come back around. We're in another one of those times, in the middle of it. If you listen to the news, if you follow social media, or even if you're just sitting around visiting with folks, and I've heard in a variety of places, I've heard these things come up. We hear how awful things are. We hear about war and rumors of war. We've just lived through a pandemic, and how many of us are worried about the world that we are leaving for our kids? Right? Some folks will say that what we're leaving for our kids is a world that is full of immorality and it is just going to burn itself out. Others are saying that we have doomed our planet and all of our kids with it. And others will point to politics and others will point to other things. And we can keep that list going on and on and on again about why the world is awful and why it is in so much trouble. And you know how many times I don't really know what. I've wanted to scream. I've wanted to rage. I've wanted to type really mean things on Facebook. I've wanted to correct people over and over and over again. All of the things that we've all wanted to do in response to things that we hear, and we're just like, no, that's not the way this works. I mean, I've heard so many suggestions for how to get through this. I even heard one Christian leader who here, I don't know, in the last several months, made the comment. He said, you can only turn the other cheek for so long, and after a while you have to stop turning. Pretty sure that's not in the Bible. And a big part of me, this is where it's so insidious. Our view of the world can be if we aren't careful, because a big part of me wants to say that he is an idiot for saying these things. And I want to do this thing. I want to point my finger at him and just say, "Dude, really? There's a reason why you very rarely ever see me point my finger at anything, because my grandmother taught fourth grade for 26 years. In fact, my aunt and uncle and my dad used to tease her about having been in the fourth grade for so long. But she used to have this thing that she would say. So anytime I don't remember exactly how this went, but you'll get the point. She used to say that, no matter, whenever you're pointing your finger at someone, look down and see how many of them are pointing back at you. There's always more pointing back at you. And I feel that because I've wanted to yell and scream, and I wanted to call people every kind of fool that I can think of. And I've been in school for a very, very long time. I know many, many, many ways of calling people a fool. But I have to be careful. If I'm going to do that, then I have to be willing to do that to myself also. So I have to do the one thing that I don't want to do. And this is for a wide variety of reasons. This is something I don't want to do. Part of it is because I have some level of undiagnosed ADHD that I've just learned to cope with, but I have lots of the mannerisms and lots of the symptoms of that. I've got lots of the tendencies for that. I'm also a recovering control freak. And so I like to be in control of things. And if you know anything about the Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram type 1. Which is all of that is to say that sitting still is not something that is in my wheelhouse. It's not even close to being in my wheelhouse. It's not something I'm really very good at. It's very hard for me to do. But I'm in that group that Jesus sat down and said, remember, all these things are going to happen. and they're going to go on, and that's just going to be a thing. And some of it is going to be some of the hardest things that you are ever going to deal with. And you're just going to have to deal with it. You can't fix it all. You can't make people believe. Jesus tells us that these things are going to happen, and what we can do is know that they'll also come to an end, because he tells us they will do that also. And then some of them will happen again, and then those times will come to an end, and then they'll happen again, and some of those times will come to an end. And he says that to get through it, we have to have faith. We have to choose every day to have faith, to choose every time to grow in faith and not fall back like Samson was such a great example of. Because even in the end, for all of his faults, and they had many, Samson still, once in his life, maybe the only time, he chose well. And the thing about it is, the more that we choose faith, for as hard as that is going to be, the more that we can manage those swings. They may not actually get easier, but we can manage them better. We know how to process them better. And this is the start of knowing Jesus as King. Because in doing that, we reshape our view of the world. And that's what Jesus is after. And it's to know that Jesus is not bound by the swings that the world will take. He is not bound by the seasons of this world. But because of that, he is the one who can take us through them. But we have to have faith. We have to have faith that he is the one that can do that, and he is the one that will follow in doing that. So, do this for me. Go through this week with all of the things that are taking place. Go into it knowing that it is not our job to fix everything. For some of us, I know that is going to be a very hard task. But our task is to be faithful and to live our lives as faithfully to the best that we can. Not perfectly, but faithfully to the best that we can. And in that process of being faithful, then we can see how Jesus is going to take us through. And that is where we want to go. And that is the start of something different. And then come back next week as we look more of what it means to say Jesus is King, and to celebrate Christ the King Sunday. Amen.